I'd be very wary of describing anything that's not 100 years old as literature, but there's no reason why you can't make the attempt to write literature with nonfiction. One of the things I did like about it early on, which also made it sort of frightening, was that it was kind of free and out there. And it wasn't in the academy. It wasn't something that even English faculties recognized. It felt so wild and free, and you could kind of make it up as you went along. The self-proclaimed godfather of creative nonfiction, Gutkin says, this is perhaps creative nonfiction's greatest asset. It offers flexibility and freedom while adhering to the basic tenets of reportage. In creative nonfiction, writers can be poetic and journalistic simultaneously. Creative nonfiction writers are encouraged to use literary and even cinematic techniques, from scene to dialogue to description to point of view, to write about themselves and others, capturing real people and real life in ways that can and have changed the world. Michael McGregor, a journalist and an associate professor of nonfiction writing at Portland State University in Oregon, worries about all that freedom Gutkin promotes. McGregor is looking for journalists who have learned to be storytellers and yet retain a fierce and ethical commitment both to dogged research and to letting the story follow the facts instead of the other way around. He has this to say: what distinguishes today's literary journalists from traditional journalists is that they trust their perceptions, accept that objectivity is a myth, and work hard to communicate the human dimensions of their subjects by using storytelling techniques, a narrative approach, a distinctive voice, scenes, and dialogue and setting. What sets them apart from those who insist on words like creative and art is that they're reporters and researchers first, gumshoes and craftsmen. Their stories always begin with strong, often exhaustive reporting. In fact, what distinguishes these new journalists from the old new journalists is a greater awareness of all the ways the stories can be reported. By spending extended amounts of time intimately involved with their subjects, for example, or bringing in relevant information from ancillary fields such as anthropology or sociology, and the firm belief that any idea can lead to an authentic story if the research is done well. In pursuit of authentic stories, they've hopped trains with hobos, followed an orchid aficionado into the Florida swamps, and mucked the rat-infested meatpacking plants that serve the fast food industry. They've used their imaginations to find the less than obvious sources of plausible, often visceral depictions of events they couldn't witness themselves. For the best narrative journalists, research drives the story, not the other way around. And this has earned them a payoff. Unlike memoir, readers still believe that narrative journalism is true, not just some heartfelt sense, but factually as well. As the Poynter Institute's Roy Peter Clark puts it, some contemporary nonfiction authors defend invention in the name of researching for some higher truth. Such claims are unjustifiable in any journalism. He also offers some advice for those writing creative nonfiction who are looking for lines one must not cross. Do not add. This means that writers of nonfiction should not add to a report things that did not happen. To make news clear and comprehensible, it's often necessary to subtract or condense. Done without care or responsibility, such subtraction can distort. We cross a more definitive line into fiction, however, when we invent or add facts or images or sounds that were not there. Do not deceive. This means that journalists should never mislead the public into reproducing events. The implied contract of all nonfiction is binding. The way it is represented here is to the best of our knowledge the way it happened. Anything that intentionally or unintentionally fools the audience violates the contract and the core purpose of journalism to get at the truth. Thus, any exception to the implied contract should be transparent or disclosed. It's not the fiction that's the problem, but the deception, Clark says. So don't add and don't deceive. If you try something unconventional, let the public in on it. Even Gutkin agrees. Real creative nonfiction, the people who really do it well, never cross the line, or try not to cross the line. They try to write verifiable truth. We can be fact-checked. We can be verified by talking to the people we've engaged with. We think the people who cross this line are writing fiction, which is fine. It's just not nonfiction.
I do. Sure. No. I'm the one who didn't write anything. So bear with me. It's interesting that Kathy started where she started, and of course she would, and that's on the end of creative nonfiction, where it touches journalism. I'm going to move to the other end, where it touches memoir, because that was my doorway into this miraculous genre. I was always an autobiographical kid. I was always writing autobiographically for school. And when I wrote my first book in 1986, I found myself writing a kind of personal essay, a kind of memoir that was intellectual autobiography and scenes from my life, and I had no idea what I was writing. I was just giving myself permission, thank God, for the first time in my life, to write out of the academic model and to write exactly the way I wanted to write, but I had no name for it because I didn't know that Mr. Gutkin had names. He is quite a pompous character.
Yeah, so
so when I heard the term, I thought, oh, okay, that's what we're talking about. I've never liked the term. I hate the word creative being tacked on as if we're trying to argue something. And it leads people who don't write or don't read a lot of literature to think it's about making up stuff, which it's certainly not. So I'd rather just call it nonfiction. I don't see why I can't call it nonfiction, which is an umbrella that embraces a lot of genres. The memoir end is the end that gets trash talked a lot. It has swamped the literary marketplace in the last generation, the last 20, 25 years. An extremely popular genre, and a couple of cases of memoirs that were, in fact, fictionalized have gotten it a very bad name. It also gets a very bad name because those who object to the proliferation of memoir on the literary scene these days call it everything from narcissistic to navel-gazing to victimology. There are so many memoirs of terrible childhoods out on the market. Some of them are brilliant, some of them are lousy, some of them are made up, some of them are not, most of them are not, and everything in between. And a number of them wind up on the Oprah show, and a number of them don't. But I think that's the source of the animus against memoir. I've always been a huge defender of memoir. I think I've always seen it as, I guess, the foundational form of literature. The first thing we want to do with words is make sense of our own experience. I'm certain that when they started drawing on caves, what they were doing was telling what happened today, out of the hunt, and what they remembered from last year's hunt, or whatever. So I think that memoir is fundamental and basic. I'm also really addicted to it, I guess, because I have taught it and I've seen it as a miraculous teaching tool for people who are 18 to 22 years old, as most of my students are, and who are for the first time collecting memories and trying to make a narrative out of their lives, trying to shape their lives into something meaningful. And reading memoir and practicing memoir, I think, is the chief way to do that. Good therapy is another way to do it, but when you start writing it down, you write it down. So that's how I came to creative nonfiction, and then discovered this sort of realm between memoir and outright journalism that might be called personal essay, and then that kind of shades into narrative journalism, and the boundaries are all very, very, very unclear. And when my students want clear boundaries, I always say, I'm not going to give them to you, I just can't. If I did, I'd be making them up. The point is not really where the boundaries are. The point is the wealth of literary power there is to be found in what actually happens in the world, as we know from Tracy Kitter. So I wrote 2 books of memoir, and then 4 or 5 years ago, I guess, embarked on a project that was really unusual for me, and that was the account of the student murder-suicide at Kalamazoo College that occurred in October of 1999. And that leads me to share a definition of creative nonfiction that I don't hear very often, but that I think is a really good one. And it was was very pertinent to my most recent project. Mike Steinberg up at Michigan State University is the founding editor of Fourth Genre, which was, I think, the second journal in the country to deal exclusively in nonfiction. Lee Beckman founded that journal called Creative Nonfiction, and that kind of ruled the roost for a while. Beckman does not accept memoir, by the way, in his journal. He's very anti-memoir, which I find really interesting. Fourth Genre is much more open, so of course that's where I went to publish some stuff. Mike and his colleague Robert Root put together an anthology of work from the magazine as a textbook for creative nonfiction classes that I snapped up and used for a couple of years. And in the introduction to that textbook, they talk about creative nonfiction as employing those literary devices that Kathy so beautifully defined to shape and present the truth. But they also added another factor, and I'm not sure this is a universal factor of nonfiction, creative nonfiction, but it's one that's really been useful for me to think about. They said most good creative nonfiction, acknowledges a personal perspective. That's what distinguishes it from traditional reportage. It acknowledges subjectivity, not as a drawback, but as the fire in the engine. It's about subjectivity. And they said that subject, the subjectivity, is coloring the entire landscape of the essay or the book, is on some kind of journey. They pointed out that in a lot of great nonfiction, there's an element of journey, of quest. And by God, it turns out to be true. I think it really turns out to be true. I noticed, for instance, that in both Strength and What Remains and the Kidder book that I'm now very belatedly catching up on, Mountains Beyond Mountains, there is a quest motif going on, not only on the part of Dale and Paul Farmer, but on the part of Tracy Kidder. He's in it because he wants questions answered, not simply about public health in Haiti or genocide in Rwanda and Burundi, but in what it is that keeps people like Dale and Paul Farmer going. When 99.9% of the rest of us would say, "You're kidding. I'm done." No. There is this weird human being in the world that won't give up. Even though there are mountains beyond mountains and bodies beyond bodies and enough injustice to make Gandhi throw his hands and go home. They don't. And I think Kidder, as a human being and as a writer these days, is really interested in finding out what makes those people tick. I am too. I'm very interested in that, so I'm very interested in Kidder. So I've really been enjoying getting to know him through reading together, really. So let's see, I guess maybe just the last thing I want to say is that my own book, The Events of October, Murder Suicide on a Small Campus, was a quest for me. I was there at the time of the killings. I knew at the time that one day I'd be writing about it. I didn't keep a single note, although I kept lots of documents. I was surprised to discover 6 years later I had kept stuff in my files and on my computer. So somewhere in me this book was brewing. And I have a pretty deep understanding already of the dynamics of violence against women, partner violence, femicide, and the other categories in which this falls. And yet, there was something I wanted to know. And I guess, in general terms, that was, what did this mean for this campus? What did this mean for everybody? What meaning did they make out of the horrendously ludicrous? I'm really interested in the way creative nonfiction can embrace trauma. I heard from a former student who's in Germany today on Facebook, and she had just finished my book and was writing, talking about reading it at work, and a secretary in her office came up and asked her what it was, and my former student, Lynette, explained what it was, and the secretary said,